Hello everyone. In this video, we will discuss very powerful topic that is IAM roles. Now, roles are used for every AWS services. IAM roles we will use for every AWS services. So it's very powerful topic in AWS. Now let's assume that we have one EC2 instances. Okay. Now let's take one example, and with that example, we will understand why there is important of IAM roles in AWS services. So let's assume that we have one EC2 instances. Okay. In this EC2 instances, this is our EC2 instances. Okay. In this EC2 instances, we have installed Linux machine. Okay. Let's assume that we have one EC2 instances. In this EC2 instances, we have one Linux machine. Now, how I can configure this Linux machine? Okay. Or how can I access this Linux machine? Now, from this Linux machine, I want to access S3 bucket. Okay. From this Linux machine, I want to access S3 bucket. From this Linux machine, I want to access S3 bucket. Okay, we have one EC2 instances. In this EC2 instances, we have installed Linux machine, and from this Linux machine, I want to access S3 bucket. Now, we will understand what are the possible ways that I can access this S3 bucket using this Linux machine. Okay, so to access the S3 bucket, I can install AWS command line interface on this Linux machine. Okay, to access this S3 bucket, I can install AWS command line interface on Linux machine. Okay, now I can configure this AWS CLI using keys. Okay, I can configure this AWS command line interface using keys. Okay, we are just understanding why IAM roles are useful in AWS services with this example. What example we have taken? Like we have one EC2 instances. In this EC2 instances, we have one Linux machine. Okay. Now, I want to access S3 bucket from this Linux machine. Okay. I can access RDS also. I can access CloudWatch also. For example, we are accessing S3 bucket using Linux machine. So what are the possible ways we are looking to access this S3 bucket? One possible way is I can install AWS command line interface on Linux machine. Now to configure this AWS command line interface, I need to use keys. Now there are two types of keys. One is secret keys. There are two types of keys. One is secret key and other is access key. There are two types to configure AWS command line interface using keys. Now there are two types of keys. One is secret keys and one is access keys. So I can configure AWS command line interface using secret keys and access keys. Okay. Now the problem here is if you don't configure keys on the Linux EC2 instances, you cannot access our AWS services. Okay. If you don't now the problem is to access S3 bucket, we are using AWS command line interface, and to configure AWS command line interface we need keys. There are two types of keys, one is secret keys and one is access keys. The problem is if you if you don't configure keys on Linux EC2 instances, if you don't configure keys on Linux EC2 instances, you cannot access AWS services. AWS services. Okay. As I told you, to configure AWS command line interface, we will use keys. What are those keys? Secret keys and access keys. Why we are using AWS command line interface on Linux machine? Because we want to access S3 bucket. Okay, right. But if you don't configure keys on the Linux EC2 instances, you cannot configure, you cannot access AWS services. That's the problem. But but if you but if you configure but if you configure keys on Linux EC2 instances, but if you configure keys on Linux EC2 instances, keys are stored keys are stored locally. Keys are stored locally on the instances. Keys are stored locally on the instances, which is not safe and secure. Which is not safe and not secure. Okay. To access S3 bucket, we are using AWS command line interface on Linux machine. Okay. Now to configure this AWS command line interface, we need to use keys. There are two types of keys, secret keys and access keys. So we will use secret keys and access keys to configure AWS command line interface. Now, if you don't configure keys on the Linux EC2 instances, you cannot access AWS services, right? But if you configure keys on the Linux EC2 instances, the keys are stored on locally on the EC2 instances, but which is not safe and secure. Like hacker can hack your access for S3 bucket, right? So to overcome this problem, we are using IAM roles. Now, so what is IAM roles then? To overcome this problem, we are using IAM roles. That's why IAM roles is very powerful topic in AWS. To configure this, we are using IAM roles. Now, what is IAM roles? It is a temporary access without credentials. If interviewer asks you what is IAM roles, we can say that it is a temporary access without credentials. If interviewer asks you what is the definition of IAM roles, it is a temporary access without credentials. And there are chances interviewer can ask you definition of IAM roles because it is important topic in AWS. Now, so I am creating IAM roles. Now I am creating, now I am to access, I want to access S3 bucket using EC2 instances. For that, I am creating IAM roles. Here I want to access S3. So I will give permissions to the S3. So here I will create IAM roles. Okay. I will create IAM roles and I will give permissions to S3 bucket. In IAM roles, I will give permission to S3 bucket to access. Right. And I will attach this S3 bucket permission to this Linux EC2 instances, right? So I will attach this permissions to Linux EC2 instances. What I am doing here, okay, I am creating IAM roles. In that IAM roles, I am giving permissions to the S3 bucket. Why I am giving permission to S3 bucket? Because I want to access S3 bucket. Okay, now after giving permission to S3 bucket, I will attach this S3 bucket to EC2 instances. If I don't attach this S3 bucket to the EC2 instances, I cannot access this S3 bucket on Linux EC2 instances. That's why I have to attach this S3 bucket to EC2 instances. Now we attach S3 and after 2 days, I don't want S3 bucket. Okay. Like I have attached S3 bucket to the EC2 instances and after 2 days, I don't want to use this S3 bucket. So I can attach and detach these policies at any time. I can attach and detach policies and at any time. I can attach and detach permissions. I can attach and detach permissions at any time. Okay. Now we have trusted entity. We have one concept here that is trusted entity. In this IAM roles, we have one concept. It is also important concept that is trusted entity. Trusted entity. What is this trusted entity? For example, we will take this example only. Okay. We want to access S3 bucket on this EC2 instances. Okay. So I will give permissions to the S3 bucket, right? I will give permission to this S3 bucket. Okay, but and I want to attach the S3 bucket to the EC2 instances. So my trusted entity here, trusted entity is EC2 instances, right? I want to access S3 bucket on EC2 instances. So if I want to access S3 bucket, that's why I will give permissions to the S3 bucket. And I want to attach the S3 bucket to the EC2 instances. So my trusted entity here is EC2 instances. Okay. If I want to access RDS on this EC2 instances, so my permissions will be RDS and my trusted entity will be EC2 instances, right? To whom we are attaching our permissions, that will be our trusted entity. Now here my trusted entity is EC2 instance. So if you use IAM roles, you no need to configure keys on the machine. Now as we will see some important topics, some important points as per the interviewer. As interviewer can ask you, if you use IAM roles, if you use IAM roles, you no need to configure keys on the machine. There is no need to configure keys on the machine if you use IAM roles. Interviewer may ask you these questions. Okay. Now another important point is one EC2 instances. One EC2 instances can have only one IAM roles. One EC2 instances can have only one IAM roles at a time. Okay. Now if two AWS services, if two AWS services wants to communicate with each other or want to talk with each other, we will use IAM roles for that. We will use IAM roles for that. If two AWS services want to talk with each other, we will use IAM roles for that. Okay. IAM roles can be attached to any AWS services. IAM roles can be attached to any AWS services. So in short, what is IAM roles? IAM roles nothing but temporary access without credentials. Okay. If you want to access any AWS services, we will create one IAM roles. In that IAM roles, we will give permission to that specific AWS services, and to whom we are providing this access or to whom we are attaching these permissions, that will be our trusted entity. And these 3 points will be important as per the interviewer point of view. If you use IAM roles, we no need to configure keys on the machine. One EC2 instances can have only one IAM roles. If two AWS services want to talk with each other, we will use IAM roles. IAM roles can be attached to any AWS services. Okay. This is all about IAM roles. We will go further deep into the other topics also and other services also. We will look in next video.